Russia is claiming an area almost twice the size of India. Not land, ice. Frozen ocean that most people assume belongs to no one. Except Russia disagrees, and they're backing that disagreement with military bases, nuclear icebreakers, and a legal argument that sounds absurd until you understand what's actually underneath all that ice. The Arctic isn't just empty frozen water. Beneath the ice lies an estimated 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of its undiscovered natural gas. There are vast deposits of rare earth minerals, essential for everything from smartphones to missile systems. Then there are the fish stocks, some of the richest on the planet, and shipping routes that could cut weeks off global trade times. Russia knows this. So does everyone else with Arctic territory. The difference is, Russia is moving faster and more aggressively than any other nation. Start with the geography. Russia's northern coastline stretches over 15,000 miles along the Arctic Ocean, longer than any other country. That alone gives them a massive advantage, but it's what they're doing with that coastline that matters. They've reopened Soviet-era military bases that were abandoned after the Cold War. These aren't small outposts. We're talking full air bases capable of housing fighter jets and bombers, along with sophisticated radar and missile defense systems. One base, Nagorskoye, sits at 80 degrees north latitude, making it one of the most remote military installations on Earth. Why go through the trouble of militarizing such a harsh, desolate region? Because the Arctic is changing. Climate change is melting the ice cap at a rate no one predicted even a decade ago. Satellite images show the difference clearly. Massive sheets of ice that existed year-round are now seasonal at best. This isn't just an environmental story. It's a geopolitical earthquake. As the ice melts, two things happen simultaneously. Resources become accessible, and new shipping lanes open up. The Northern Sea Route runs along Russia's Arctic coast, connecting Europe to Asia. Right now, if you want to ship goods from Rotterdam to Shanghai, you sail south through the Suez Canal, a journey of roughly 12,000 miles taking about a month. The Northern Sea Route cuts that distance to 8,000 miles, and the time to about 2 weeks. The problem has always been ice, thick, impassable, and present for most of the year. But that's changing. In 2010, only 4 ships made the journey. By 2020, that number had climbed to over 30. Russia is betting that within a couple of decades, this route will rival traditional shipping lanes, and they want total control over it. Here's where it gets complicated. Under international law, specifically the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, countries have exclusive economic rights up to 200 nautical miles from their coastline. Beyond that, it's international waters, free for anyone to use. Russia is arguing that their continental shelf extends far beyond that 200-mile limit, meaning they should have economic control over a much larger portion of the Arctic seabed. To prove this, they've conducted extensive underwater surveys and even planted a Russian flag on the ocean floor directly beneath the North Pole back in 2007. It was a symbolic gesture, but the legal claim behind it is very real. The key to their argument is something called the Lomonosov Ridge, an underwater mountain range that stretches across the Arctic Ocean. Russia claims this ridge is a natural extension of their continental shelf, which would grant them rights to the resources on and beneath it. If accepted, this would give Russia control over an area containing billions of barrels of oil and trillions of cubic feet of natural gas. Other countries, particularly Canada and Denmark, have made similar claims about the ridge, arguing that it connects to their territory instead. The result is a legal tug-of-war playing out in slow motion at the United Nations, with each country submitting surveys, data, and scientific arguments to support their case. But Russia isn't just waiting for a legal verdict. Of icebreakers, more than 40 of them, with 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 40 of them, of icebreakers, more than 40 of them, with several nuclear powered. No other country comes close. The United States, by comparison, has 2 functional icebreakers. Russia's dominance in icebreaker technology gives them an enormous practical advantage. These ships can escort cargo vessels through ice-choked waters, perform search and rescue operations, and assert a physical presence in areas where most nations simply can't operate. It's hard to dispute someone's claim when they're the only ones who can actually get there. Then there's the resource extraction angle. Russia has already begun drilling in Arctic waters, pulling oil and gas from fields that were inaccessible just years ago. The Yamal Peninsula, located in Russia's Arctic region, is home to some of the largest natural gas reserves in the world. Massive liquefied natural gas facilities have been constructed there, and tankers now regularly transport gas to Europe and Asia via the Northern Sea route. This isn't speculative. It's happening right now, generating billions in revenue and making Russia less dependent on overland pipelines that pass through other countries. Yet the Arctic gold rush isn't without risks. The environment up there is fragile, and an oil spill in those conditions would be catastrophic, with freezing temperatures making cleanup nearly impossible. There are also the indigenous communities who have lived in the Arctic for thousands of years, now watching as their homeland becomes a geopolitical chessboard. Russia has faced criticism for both environmental practices and treatment of indigenous groups, though such concerns rarely slow down resource extraction when this much money is involved. What happens next depends on ice, law, and power. If the ice continues melting at current rates, the Arctic will look completely different within our lifetimes. New shipping lanes will open permanently, military access will expand, and resource extraction will accelerate. But the legal framework governing all of this remains unclear. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea provides some structure, yet it was written long before climate change made the Arctic a strategic priority. Updating international law takes decades, and Russia isn't interested in waiting. They're establishing facts on the ground, or rather on the ice, that will be difficult to reverse regardless of what any tribunal decides. One factor often overlooked is how Russia views the Arctic compared to other nations. For countries like the United States or Canada, the Arctic is a distant frontier, important but not central to national identity. For Russia, it's different. A massive portion of their landmass lies within the Arctic Circle. Entire cities exist up there, some with populations exceeding 100,000 people. Murmansk, for example, is the largest city in the world located above the Arctic Circle, home to Russia's Northern Fleet and a critical hub for Arctic operations. This isn't some remote outpost they're trying to develop from scratch. It's integrated into their infrastructure, economy, and military strategy in ways that give them an inherent advantage. The Soviet Union invested heavily in Arctic development during the Cold War, building entire supply chains, research stations, and transportation networks designed to function in extreme conditions. When the USSR collapsed, much of this infrastructure fell into disrepair. But over the past 2 decades, Russia has been rebuilding and modernizing it, pouring billions into projects that signal long-term commitment. They're not treating the Arctic as a speculative venture. It's a core component of their future. China has also taken notice. Despite having no Arctic coastline, China declared itself a near-Arctic state and has invested heavily in research, infrastructure, and partnerships with Arctic nations. They've funded icebreaker construction, participated in shipping trials along the Northern Sea route, and expressed interest in accessing Arctic resources. Russia has welcomed Chinese investment to a degree, particularly for large energy projects that require significant capital. But there's tension beneath the surface. Russia wants Chinese money without ceding control, while China wants access without becoming entirely dependent on Russian goodwill. It's a partnership built on mutual interest rather than trust. Then there's NATO, which has ramped up its own Arctic activities in response to Russia's expansion. Joint military exercises now take place regularly in northern Norway, and the alliance has discussed increasing its presence in the region. The problem is that NATO members don't have the same level of Arctic capability that Russia does. Building that capacity from scratch takes years and enormous investment, and there's debate within the alliance about whether it's worth prioritizing given other global threats. Some members see the Arctic as critical, others view it as a distraction. What makes this entire situation more complicated is that much of it plays out in slow motion. There are no dramatic invasions or overnight territorial grabs. Instead, it's a gradual accumulation of infrastructure, presence, and legal claims that shift the balance over time. A new airfield here, another icebreaker there, a research station established on a remote island. Individually, none of these moves seem earth-shattering. Collectively, they add up to dominance. Russia has also revived Soviet-era plans for Arctic shipping routes, not just for international trade, but for domestic connectivity. Moving goods across Russia's vast northern territories by land is expensive and slow. Ships traveling along the coast offer a faster alternative, and as ice recedes, this becomes increasingly viable. The economic logic is straightforward, but it also means Russia is building a parallel system of ports, supply depots, and naval facilities that double as military assets. Environmental groups have raised alarms about what unchecked development could mean for the Arctic ecosystem. The region is home to species found nowhere else on Earth, and the ice itself plays a crucial role in regulating global climate patterns. Increased shipping brings risks of oil spills, noise pollution that disrupts marine life, and the introduction of invasive species. Mining and drilling operations scar the landscape and threaten fragile habitats. Russia has environmental regulations on paper, but enforcement in remote areas is notoriously weak, and economic priorities typically override ecological concerns. There's also the human element. Indigenous communities across the Arctic have watched their environment transform faster than anywhere else on the planet. Traditional hunting and fishing grounds are disappearing. Coastlines are eroding. Permafrost is thawing, causing buildings to collapse and releasing methane trapped for millennia. For these communities, the Arctic isn't a resource frontier or a military theatre, it's home. Yet their voices are often drowned out by the competing interests of governments and corporations. The strategic calculus around the Arctic also ties into global energy markets. Russia is one of the world's largest exporters of oil and natural gas, and much of their future production capacity is expected to come from Arctic reserves. Europe has tried to reduce dependence on Russian energy, particularly after geopolitical tensions escalated, but replacing that supply isn't simple. Arctic gas fields represent a leverage point Russia can use in negotiations, and they know it. Control over these resources translates directly into geopolitical influence. Meanwhile, the technology required to operate in the Arctic continues advancing. Satellite surveillance has improved dramatically, making it harder to hide military movements or illegal activity. Drones capable of withstanding extreme cold are being deployed for reconnaissance and monitoring. Even submarine activity, traditionally difficult to track beneath ice, is becoming more transparent as sensor networks improve. These technological shifts cut both ways. They allow for better enforcement of international rules, but they also enable more sophisticated military operations. What remains uncertain is how all these factors will interact as the ice continues retreating. Will international law adapt quickly enough to prevent conflict? Will economic opportunities lead to cooperation or competition? Can environmental destruction be mitigated, or is it an inevitable cost of development? Russia is betting they can shape the answers to these questions by acting decisively now before the rest of the world catches up. Whether that strategy succeeds depends on variables that are still unfolding. One factor that doesn't get enough attention is China's role in all of this. Beijing has declared itself a near-Arctic state, a term that has no basis in international law but signals their intentions clearly. China has invested heavily in Arctic research stations, icebreaker construction, and partnerships with Arctic nations. They're particularly interested in shipping routes that could cut travel time between Asia and Europe by weeks. Russia has welcomed Chinese investment in Arctic energy projects, viewing it as a counterbalance to Western pressure. But this partnership comes with complications. China's economic footprint in the Arctic could eventually rival Russia's, creating a dependency Moscow might come to regret. For now, though, the two countries share a common interest in challenging the existing order, and that alignment shapes how Arctic politics unfold. The United States, meanwhile, has been slower to respond. American icebreaker capacity is embarrassingly limited compared to Russia's fleet. The Coast Guard operates just 2 polar icebreakers, one of which is decades old and constantly breaking down. Plans to build more have been discussed for years, but funding remains inconsistent. This isn't just about keeping up with Russia. It's about having the ability to operate in a region that's becoming strategically vital. Without adequate icebreakers, the US can't conduct regular patrols, support scientific research, or respond to emergencies. It's a gap that becomes more glaring as Arctic activity intensifies. NATO has also taken notice. The alliance conducted its largest Arctic exercises in decades, simulating scenarios that involve defending northern territories against aggression. Norway, a NATO member with significant Arctic territory, has upgraded its military infrastructure and hosts rotational forces from allied nations. Finland and Sweden joining NATO adds another layer of complexity, extending the alliance's reach further into the Arctic. Russia views this expansion as a direct threat, and it's part of why they've militarized their own northern territories so aggressively. The Cold War comparisons aren't entirely unfounded. Both sides are preparing for contingencies they hope never materialize, but the preparations themselves create tension. Legally, the Arctic operates under a patchwork of treaties and agreements that weren't designed for the current situation. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea allows countries to claim extended continental shelves if they can prove geological connections. Russia has submitted claims that extend far beyond their coastline, arguing that underwater ridges link their territory to the North Pole itself. Other nations have submitted competing claims, and the process of adjudicating these disputes is slow and contentious. There's no enforcement mechanism if a country simply ignores the rulings. International law in the Arctic relies heavily on voluntary compliance, which works only as long as everyone agrees to play by the rules. The Arctic Council, established in 1996, was supposed to be the forum where these issues get resolved. Its members include the 8 Arctic nations, and it focuses on environmental protection and sustainable development. Indigenous groups have permanent participant status, giving them a voice in decisions that affect their communities. For years, the Council functioned reasonably well, fostering cooperation even when member states had broader geopolitical disagreements. But that cooperation has frayed. Meetings have been postponed or scaled back. Joint projects have stalled. The war in Ukraine essentially froze collaboration between Russia and the other 7 members. The Council still exists, but its effectiveness has been gutted, leaving a vacuum where multilateral dialogue used to happen. Resource extraction in the Arctic isn't limited to oil and gas. Rare earth minerals, critical for manufacturing everything from smartphones to electric vehicles, are found in significant deposits across the region. Greenland, an autonomous territory of Denmark, sits on some of the richest mineral reserves anywhere on Earth. As ice recedes, accessing those deposits becomes feasible, and multiple countries have expressed interest in securing mining rights. Greenland's government has to balance economic opportunities against environmental risks and the preferences of its population. It's a delicate position, made more complicated by external pressure from nations eager to reduce dependence on Chinese-controlled rare earth supplies. Fishing is another flashpoint. As Arctic waters warm, fish populations are shifting northward, following the temperature ranges they need to survive. This migration brings commercially valuable species into areas that were previously ice-covered and inaccessible. Fishing fleets from multiple nations have followed, and there's limited regulation governing who can fish where. Overfishing could devastate populations before sustainable practices are established. International agreements on Arctic fishing exist, but enforcement is patchy, and illegal fishing remains a persistent problem. The same surveillance technology that tracks military activity could theoretically monitor fishing vessels, but there's little political will to invest in that kind of oversight. Tourism is increasing as well, driven by people wanting to see the Arctic before it changes irreversibly. Cruise ships now navigate routes that were impassable just a decade ago. While tourism brings economic benefits to remote communities, it also brings risks. A ship running aground or suffering a mechanical failure in Arctic waters could lead to an environmental disaster, and rescue infrastructure is virtually non-existent in many areas. The region's isolation, once a protective barrier, now makes any accident exponentially more dangerous. All of these dynamics feed into a larger question. Who gets to decide the Arctic's future? The 8 Arctic nations have geographic claims, but their decisions affect the entire planet. Melting ice contributes to rising sea levels that threaten coastal cities thousands of miles away. Changes in ocean currents influence weather patterns globally. The Arctic isn't just a regional issue, yet the mechanisms for including non-Arctic voices in decision-making are limited. Some have proposed expanding international governance frameworks, but Arctic nations resist ceding control. They view their sovereignty over northern territories as non-negotiable, even as the consequences of their actions ripple outward. Russia's strategy, then, isn't operating in isolation. It's a response to overlapping pressures: economic necessity, military competition, environmental change, and geopolitical rivalry. They're moving aggressively because they believe the window for securing their position is closing. Other nations are waking up to the Arctic's importance, and Russia wants to be entrenched before the competition fully mobilizes. That entrenchment isn't limited to military hardware. Russia's also investing heavily in dual-use infrastructure, facilities that serve both civilian and strategic purposes. New ports along the Northern Sea Route can handle commercial shipping traffic while also functioning as naval resupply points. Airports built to support resource extraction projects double as forward operating bases. Roads and rail lines constructed to connect remote mining sites also enable rapid troop movement. This approach provides plausible deniability. If questioned about militarization, Russia can point to economic justifications. But the effect is the same: increased capacity to project power across the Arctic. China's entered this equation too, despite having no Arctic territory. They've declared themselves a near-Arctic state, a designation with no basis in international law, but one they're using to justify involvement. Chinese investment has flowed into Arctic projects, particularly in Russia. When Western sanctions limited Russia's access to capital and technology, China stepped in. Joint ventures now dot the Russian Arctic, focused on energy extraction and shipping infrastructure. For China, the Northern Sea Route represents a potential alternative to traditional shipping lanes that pass through Southeast Asian choke points. Reducing dependence on routes like the Strait of Malacca has been a strategic priority for decades. An Arctic passage offers that, assuming ice conditions continue improving. But China's interest goes beyond shipping. They're funding research stations, deploying icebreakers, and participating in Arctic governance forums as an observer. Their goal appears to be establishing a foothold that could translate into influence later. Other nations watch this nervously. The idea of Chinese military vessels operating in Arctic waters would represent a fundamental shift in regional power dynamics. Right now, it's speculative. In 20 years, it might not be. The United States has been slower to respond, partly because Alaska's infrastructure lags behind Russia's Arctic development. America has only 2 functional icebreakers, compared to Russia's fleet of over 40. Plans to build more have been announced repeatedly, but funding battles and construction delays mean new ships remain years away. Meanwhile, US military presence in the Arctic consists largely of existing bases in Alaska and periodic exercises. There's recognition that more needs to happen, but translating that recognition into concrete action has proven difficult. Political priorities shift, budgets get reallocated, and Arctic initiatives often lose out to more immediate concerns elsewhere. NATO's tried to fill some gaps. Joint exercises in Norway and Iceland aim to improve cold weather readiness and test coordination among member states. But these exercises reveal significant weaknesses. Equipment designed for temperate climates fails in extreme cold. Logistics networks struggle with distances and isolation. Troops accustomed to operating in Europe or the Middle East find Arctic conditions uniquely challenging. Building true operational capability would require sustained investment over years, and it's unclear whether political will exist for that commitment. Indigenous communities throughout the Arctic watch all this with deep ambivalence. For them, the region isn't a frontier to be conquered or a resource to be exploited. It's home. Increased military activity, expanded shipping, and accelerated resource extraction threaten traditional ways of life that have existed for millennia. Hunting and fishing grounds face disruption. Sacred sites risk desecration. Pollution from industrial projects contaminates ecosystems that communities depend on. Yet, these same communities often have minimal voice in decisions being made about their territories. Some governments have made efforts to include indigenous perspectives in Arctic policy discussions, but meaningful consultation remains inconsistent. Economic benefits from development projects are promised, but indigenous communities have heard similar promises before, only to see profits flow elsewhere while they're left with environmental damage and social disruption. Trust is in short supply. The gap between policy rhetoric about respecting indigenous rights and actual practice on the ground remains wide. Climate change compounds everything. Predictions about ice melt and temperature increases carry enormous uncertainty. Some models suggest the Arctic could be ice-free in summer within 2 decades. Others push that timeline further out. But even optimistic projections show dramatic transformation. Ecosystems adapted to cold will struggle or collapse. Species dependent on ice will face extinction. Permafrost thaw will release methane, a greenhouse gas far more potent than carbon dioxide, potentially accelerating warming in a feedback loop. The consequences extend far beyond the Arctic itself. Russia's gambling that they can extract economic value fast enough to offset the costs of this transformation. Their entire strategy assumes they'll secure access to resources and shipping routes before conditions deteriorate to the point where operations become untenable. It's a narrow window. Too slow, and competitors establish themselves. Too fast, and infrastructure investments might become stranded assets if environmental conditions shift unpredictably. They're threading a needle while the fabric itself is changing. Other nations face similar calculations. Everyone's operating with incomplete information, trying to position themselves for futures they can't fully predict. The Arctic has become a giant experiment in crisis-driven geopolitics, where decisions made today lock in consequences for decades. Reversing course becomes harder with each investment, each base established, each territorial claim staked. Momentum builds toward outcomes no one explicitly chose, but everyone contributed to creating. The Northern Sea Route exemplifies this dynamic. As ice recedes, shipping companies experiment with Arctic passages, testing feasibility. Each successful transit generates data that informs the next attempt. Insurance companies adjust risk assessments. Port authorities upgrade facilities. Nations enhance surveillance and search and rescue capabilities. Gradually, what seemed impossible becomes routine. But this normalization happens without comprehensive international agreement on rules governing Arctic shipping. Ad hoc arrangements and national regulations create a patchwork system vulnerable to gaps and conflicts. Russia's positioned itself as the gatekeeper for much of this route, requiring permits and escort services for vessels transiting their territorial waters. This gives them leverage over global shipping patterns and revenue from fees. But it also creates dependencies that other nations find uncomfortable. Relying on Russia for access to Arctic routes means accepting their terms, their regulations, their potential to disrupt traffic for political reasons. China's watching all of this with particular interest. They've declared themselves a near-Arctic state, a designation with no legal standing but significant political implications. Chinese shipping companies are major potential users of Northern Sea Route passages. Their Belt and Road Initiative includes an Arctic component, envisioning infrastructure investments that would give them stake in the region's development. But their ambitions bump against Russian territorial claims and Western concerns about authoritarian powers gaining Arctic footholds. The result is a complicated dance where China courts Russia as a partner, while hedging against overdependence on any single nation's goodwill. Beneath all the geopolitical maneuvering lies a fundamental question that no one's adequately answered. Who benefits from this transformation? Resource extraction will generate profits for corporations and tax revenue for governments. Shipping companies will save time and fuel costs. Military forces will gain new operational capabilities. But these benefits concentrate among already powerful actors. The communities most affected by Arctic change receive the smallest share of gains while bearing disproportionate risks. Environmental costs won't be paid by those making extraction decisions. Future generations will inherit depleted ecosystems and altered climate systems they had no voice in creating. Designed to manage global common struggle to keep pace. The Arctic Council brings together nations with Arctic territory to coordinate on environmental protection and sustainable development. But it lacks enforcement mechanisms. Recommendations carry weight only when member states choose to implement them. Military security questions fall outside its mandate entirely, creating a gap between environmental governance and the geopolitical competition actually shaping the region's future. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea provides framework for maritime boundaries and resource rights, but disputes over interpretations persist. Extended continental shelf claims remain unresolved. Russia submitted theirs in 2001, revised it in 2015, and still awaits full adjudication. Denmark and Canada have overlapping claims with Russia. The process moves slowly, while physical changes accelerate. What's striking about Russia's Arctic strategy is how much it reveals about their broader worldview. They see the Arctic as validation that geography still matters in an age of globalization. That control of territory and resources remains fundamental to national power. That military strength secures economic opportunity. It's a 19th century great power logic applied to 21st century climate crisis. Whether that logic produces outcomes they desire remains uncertain. History offers cautionary examples of nations overcommitting to strategies that seem promising but proved unsustainable. Imperial overreach has many forms. Betting your economic future on resource extraction in an environmentally unstable region while alienating potential partners carries obvious risks. Yet dismissing Russia's Arctic ambitions as doomed would be premature. They possess genuine advantages in this competition. Geographic position matters. Decades of Arctic experience matter. Willingness to accept risks others avoid matters. They might actually pull off their gambit, establishing themselves as the dominant Arctic power and reaping economic rewards that offset enormous investments. Or they might find themselves maintaining expensive infrastructure in a region that didn't deliver promised returns, having sacrificed opportunities elsewhere. The outcome depends on variables no one controls. How fast will ice melt? How much will resource prices fluctuate? Will international tensions escalate or ease? Will technological changes make Arctic operations easier or render them obsolete? Russia's making enormous commitments based on assumptions about all these questions. They're confident in their answers. Time will test that confidence. The rest of the world faces its own calculations about how to respond. Matching Russia's military buildup risks accelerating an arms race nobody wants. Ignoring their moves cedes them unopposed advantage. Somewhere between those extremes lies a path that protects national interests without triggering escalation. Finding that path requires balancing competing pressures. Defense establishments push for greater presence. Environmental advocates demand protection. Economic interests want access. Indigenous communities seek recognition. Diplomatic corps tries managing relationships. Each constituency has legitimate concerns. None has complete picture. Policy emerges from negotiations between these perspectives, often satisfying no one fully, but preventing any single view from dominating. What's clear is that the Arctic's transformation is accelerating, regardless of whether the world is prepared for it. Ice continues melting. Temperatures keep rising. Russia keeps building. Other nations keep responding. The region's being remade by forces both natural and human, creating conditions unprecedented in modern history. How this story ends depends partly on choices being made now, and partly on factors beyond anyone's control. The Arctic has always been a place of extremes. Extreme cold, extreme isolation, extreme beauty, extreme harshness. Now it's becoming a place of extreme change and extreme consequences. What happens there won't stay there. The strategic competition unfolding across Arctic ice will shape global power dynamics for generations. Resource flows from the region will impact economies worldwide. Climate feedbacks triggered by Arctic warming will accelerate changes everywhere, and the precedents being set for how nations handle contested spaces and environmental crises will influence responses to future challenges. Russia's bet on the Arctic is ultimately a bet on a particular vision of the future, one where they've successfully navigated climate catastrophe to emerge stronger, where military power secures prosperity, where geography still determines destiny. Whether that future arrives, or whether something else entirely emerges, the Arctic will be where we find out. The ice is melting, the race is on, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Looking at this from above, it all comes down to timing. Russia's pushing forward because they believe the next 20 years represent their best chance to lock in Arctic dominance before the rest of the world mobilizes effectively. They're building infrastructure that will last decades based on assumptions about ice melt, shipping viability, and resource accessibility that might not hold. Every nation involved is making similar gambles with incomplete information. The difference is Russia's staking more of their future on being right. They're converting the Arctic from a frozen barrier into a strategic asset, but that conversion only works if environmental, economic, and political conditions align the way they're predicting. The Arctic isn't just changing, it's being fundamentally reimagined as something it's never been before. A resource frontier, a shipping highway, a military theatre, all overlapping in ways that create new risks nobody fully understands. What's happening up there now will determine which nations hold leverage in conflicts that haven't started yet, and shape economic patterns that will persist for generations. The ice is melting, whether anyone wants it to or not. The only question left is who controls what emerges underneath.